Right, hey guys, how are we doing? Back on another video from Any News, more cut content from MUSHOKU Tensei Season 2, covering Episode 1, the true nature of Rudeus' depression. So, I think this is going to be like, yeah, he was depressed in the anime, but he was really depressed in the original source material. So, let's see how depressed Rudeus actually was.
Episode 1 doesn't hesitate to highlight Rudy's depression, but there are actually two very important aspects I feel aren't as fleshed out as they should be. The first is the whole plan Rudy concocted to find his mother, and the second is the extent to just how broken he really is inside. They're both elements that are definitely present, but nowhere near as prominent as they were in the novels.
Wow, that is one look of sadness and a bit of confusion.
And it's that bit of cut content that helps to explain a lot of the choices that Rudy makes here. So, as we kick off another season of Mushoku Tensei, let's take a look at what the anime left out from the novels.
Alright.
Let's get started. Episode 25, The Broken-Hearted Magician,
Bless.
covering chapters 1 and 2 from Volume 7 of the light novel.
Okay.
Where we currently find our depressed protagonist is a particular forest known to many as Worm's Whiskers, a dense woods that separated Asura's northern border from the valley known as the Redworm's Upper Jaw. For those familiar with my cut content from last season, you'd
Dragon.
recognize this as the northern counterpart to the path Rudeus was on when he encountered Orsted.
Right.
It was the only other route that provided relatively safe passage through the dragon-filled mountains surrounding the Asuran border. The journey from there had only been a few days so far, but from here to the duchy Rudy was heading to, there were at least another 2 months left by carriage.
Okay. And I do like that there is actually like world and maps and stuff. This is really, when people think about the world and, the planning and how. It's cool.
It was a lengthy journey of countless sighs and uncomfortable silence in which Rudy was the sole cause of. Before we talk about that crippling depression, though, there was a bit of backstory given on the caravan itself, specifically the merchant who was running it. As a simple traveling merchant who was on the up and up, Bruno had been tasked with transporting 2 carriages of goods from Asura to the Northern Territories.
Bruno. Love it.
It was a valuable shipment that, if lost, would likely mean the end of his career and his life.
Damn.
So, given that the journey was quite the dangerous one, it was only natural Bruno hire adventurers to help him protect it.
Okay. Wow. Makes sense. Alright.
I mean, the path itself was one that very few merchants would ever even
Why
risk
they would
traveling. There were just too many
close.
monsters inhabiting the forest. So much so that it was actually cheaper for Asura to build a giant wall instead of constantly pay adventurers to exterminate them. That being the case, there was a total of 8 people that accompanied him on this journey. 5 paid guards who were members of the B-ranked party Counter Arrow,
Okay.
2 swordsmen in training that were seeking passage to the north, then 1 gloomy magician who was also in need of transportation. Those last 3 technically weren't guards like the adventurers, but if there did happen to be some sort of ambush, Bruno did
Yeah, they're not gonna not get involved, So if it's gonna try and kill you, you're gonna try and kill it back.
expect them to help fight as well. It was their lives too that would be on the line after all. Now, just as how we saw in the anime, Rudy's depression was so apparent that you could practically hear exactly what he was thinking. He was the embodiment of an empty void whose mere presence sucked the life out of everything, thus the reason the carriage was so entirely lifeless. When Suzanne had tried to make conversation, while his responses were loud and filled with energy, his expressions were fully contradictory.
Yeah, they're
all
all
the way to the
fake.
point where he just flat out refused to participate in the conversation.
It's like in so it's not in this episode, but it's in the second episode, isn't it? The guy says it pisses him off how fake his smiles are and that, and it's even more apparent in that drawing than it was in the anime. Like, you can see that. So yeah.
To some that may have been seen as rude, but to travelers who were on the road often, it was an unspoken rule to not get too nosy into other people's affairs. If a fellow traveler didn't want to talk, then that would be that and nothing more would be made of it.
Leave it
So,
be.
for Sarah to ignore this custom and pry even further, well, that was something that highlighted her inexperience and youth.
Oh, okay.
It was
right,
our
yeah,
first look into this new character whose very personality resembled Eris.
Yeah, there's similarities there, and right, yeah, she is inexperienced and is breaking rules, and that helps show that. I like that. So much thought into the characters.
Now, when Rudy gave the reason for his behavior, everything began to make sense as this was a scenario that they were all too familiar with. You see, as a party that helped a lot with Fatoa's recovery effort, they'd seen Rudeus's exact expression numerous times before. It was the face of someone who'd experienced crushing loss. It may not have been for the exact reason they were thinking of, but the melancholy was all the same regardless, leading Suzanne to pry even further. It was clear she felt pity for the boy in front of her and, as such, asked more questions despite knowing how annoyed it would make Rudeus feel. So, seeing as how Suzanne wasn't going to stop, Rudy led on this superficial conversation just to appease her. He wasn't really paying attention to it, but she did say some things that were worth acknowledging. Like, the reason her and her party were heading north was mainly due to the lack of jobs fitting their skill in the Asura region.
Right.
Since the monsters there were much weaker than the monsters here, their plan was to move north and re-establish themselves in the Magic Nations. Sure, the competition may be tougher what with all the veteran adventurers and warriors in training, but with such a high density of monsters being present, there were more than enough jobs to go around for all of them. It was
Makes
just
sense
mere
to just do
coincidence
that, yeah.
that Rudy happened to be on the same journey as them.
Coincidence? Or was it part of the narrative?
This wasn't a location he chose for any particular reason, but was instead somewhere that just wasn't Fatoa. It honestly could have been anywhere. So, where he ended up at the end of this 2-month journey was the city of Rosenberg in the Duchy of Basharan,
I like that
a
name.
place commonly referred to as the gateway to the Northern Territories. As the core location from which magical tools were exported, the revenue made here made up more than half of the entire country's. Now, the first thing Rudy did once here was find an inn where he wouldn't freeze to death. You see, something Suzanne had mentioned which he actually picked up on was that any inn meant for the C or D ranked didn't come with heating. So, if you didn't want to sleep in a room the same temperature as outside, then it was best to stay at an inn for the B ranked or higher.
Yeah. Ooh. Bit discriminatory, isn't it? But maybe they can't afford it either, and that's why they take in the lower ranks.
It was a place definitely more expensive
Did you ever
than
think
many
about that?
of the
Hey?
others, but for Rudy that really wasn't much of an issue. Because both Eris and Ruijerd left without taking any share of the money they'd earned, Rudy had pretty much all the money Dead End made during their entire time adventuring.
And he's spending it. Oh my god, I can't wait for them to be like, hey, you still got that money? You kind of owe us. He'd be like, no, I made sure to stay at a S-rank place with double the heating.
Not to mention a little bit extra from when he'd helped Alphonse at the refugee camp. So that's why he seems to have so much money here.
Right. That
It
makes
was
sense
after
as
he'd
well.
settled
Cool.
in that every moment was spent actively avoiding any and all thoughts of Eris. He would look outside, admire the scenery, take in the nature, and even acknowledge Basharan's infrastructure. But the moment any of those thoughts stagnated, he would immediately focus on Eris again. Her name would just
mate.
subconsciously slip out of his mouth on its own, leading to a downward spiral of emotion the anime unfortunately doesn't portray very well. I'm sure we're all well aware of just how much a shock Eris's departure was for Rudy,
Yeah,
but
damn,
when you
God,
find out the way that he himself perceives it, well, that just adds a whole nother layer of depression to the mix. I mean, he was so convinced that the two of them loved each other that he was already planning the future they would share together. He assumed he'd support her now that she'd lost her parents, commit to her for every day of the rest of their lives, then live that life together somewhere in Asada. Sure, there may have been a few obstacles given their noble bloodlines, but Rudy was so determined to protect her and give his all that no amount of people opposing them would prevent them from being together. He was ready to stand against any enemy and even run away if need be. Now, Rudy thought Eris may have felt the same way, but after her sudden departure and cryptic note, his only thoughts were of just how mistaken he was.
Yeah.
To him, he felt he didn't mean anything to her. To him, she was just completely done with him. His self-esteem was right back to where it was before he reincarnated. So, whenever Rudy's mind went to the love he thought he shared, the only reassurance he could give himself was the fact that he was lucky to have been given such happiness at all.
In the first place.
It didn't
yeah.
matter how brief of a moment it was, because for a person like him, to expect someone to fall in love with him was just ridiculous. He truly believed that such a feat was flat out impossible now. When Rudy was finally able to move on from that, his next thoughts were of how he was going to search for Zenith. A rather important topic considering it is the reason he supposedly
Yeah,
left
it's
the
like,
sewer floor.
let's go find
It's
Mother.
also the core
Let's
motivation
go
for a lot
save
of the
our
decisions he makes
mom.
later on in the episode. I don't know why they decided not to include it, but we can pretty much sum it up all like this. Zenith's been missing for more than a couple years now, so it was extremely unlikely she was anywhere easily discoverable. She definitely wasn't going to be found in a major city like...
God, I hope she's still alive. My God, she has to be. That's going to be horrible. Oh, I can see this season being nothing but just despair and sadness.
This, but with such a massive population to gather information from, they were definitely the best places to find clues in. That said, at the end of the day, Rudy was just a single boy. No matter how thorough he was, he'd never be able to search the city in its entirety, let alone the entire world. So, rather than search for a single left-handed person in a crowd of 10,000, Rudy got the idea of getting the crowd to work for him. What if he told that crowd the person he was looking for? Eventually, that information would spread to everyone, and that single left-handed person might just step forward themselves.
Interesting.
As for how he was going to do that, well, the easiest way was to make himself famous.
Make a name for yourself.
If he could somehow forge this identity as a prominent adventurer, then it likely wouldn't be long until his story would pass between other guilds. All he had to do was pull off a few impressive feats, then share who he was. After which, it was just a matter of dealing with leads and sifting through information. Now, as good of a plan as this was, Rudy didn't have much faith he'd have any luck with it. Not only had it already been several years since Zenith had gone missing, but with a massive organization like the Search and Rescue Squad trying and failing to find her too, what luck would Rudy and his significantly less resources have? It was a despair-filled thought that made him wonder if it was all just a big waste of time. With zero alternatives and a promise he made to his dad though, the only option was to try anyway.
Keep going.
It was better than just sitting around doing nothing. Fast forward to the next day, and while normally Rudy wouldn't care what people in the Adventurers Guild were saying about him, today every unkind word stung more than the last. It seems he was a lot more susceptible to people's opinions on him. When he went to the front desk to disband his party next, a major difference I'm surprised they didn't include was the sudden breakdown Rudy had while doing so.
Oh.
You see, rather than the pensive stare we got in the anime, there was a whole waterfall of tears that came from knowing that Dead End was, well, dead.
No.
It's not like he had intended to cry here, but the emotional attachment he had to such a defining part
it
of
makes
his life
sense.
was something I suppose he just wasn't willing to part with yet.
Oh, I think they should have at least put something in. You know, at least like, maybe like a tear and then shrugging it away or something. Ah.
It was the moment he had come to realize that he was truly alone. A painful fact he wasn't ready to be confronted with yet. I don't know why they didn't decide to show this, but
Yeah,
without a
that's mad.
vulnerable moment like that, I feel Rudy's emotional distress isn't made as apparent. There were numerous times where he should have been close to tears just from the mention of Eris or Rudeus, but many of those moments were replaced with a more stoic Rudeus. So you'll just have to believe me when I say Rudeus truly was a broken mess right now. After the tears were settled and a job was chosen, we find out that the pain stifling his chest was a type of trauma stemming from a very specific mindset. Whenever he felt it didn't matter if he lived or died, it was that blatant disregard for life which would cause it.
Whoa.
A defeatist mentality that contradicted everything he vowed to do better this time. His holy relic didn't really do much to diminish the pain itself, but holding on to it did make him
Holy
feel
relic.
better.
Love that.
And if you just so happen to want one of these holy relics yourself, then you can actually get the card version from my streams every Sunday.
What?
It's just a little promo for my Twitch where I talk about Mushoku Tensei Live, then open up some card packs for it.
Oh, that's weird.
Now, remember when I
That's weird
said
to-
finding
oh.
Zenith was the core motivation for a lot of Rudy's decisions? Well, deciding to party up with Suzanne here was actually one of them. If he was gonna make a name for himself and spread his
Can't do it by
story, then
himself.
the best way to do that was to get to know other adventurers. Sure, he could do the most amazing things solo, but if no one was around to see them happen,
What's the
then
point?
at best the story that would spread would just be these vague rumors.
Yeah.
Mainly because adventurers weren't very interested in other adventurers. Especially not some kid they didn't care about. So, the best way Rudy figured he could spread his story was by joining as many parties as possible. With enough work and enough time, surely his name and story would eventually spread to other guilds. He just needed to find a party willing to take him. Of course, just like we saw in the anime, it was none other than Suzanne and her misplaced sympathy that would make that job extremely easy for him this time. She had just watched Rudy bawl his eyes out and, as a result, felt enough pity to invite him to the party, leading to their joint handling of that A-rank job involving the Luster Grizzlies.
Cool, yeah.
With this formally introducing the members of Counter Arrow,
Wow,
we were
Troy's
given
cool,
a bit more context as to each person's position and what they were capable of. There's not much more to be said about Suzanne or Timothy, but for Mimir he was the intermediate rank in healing magic, then beginner in detoxification. Patrice had additional skills as a mage, but with the only spells he knew being beginner rank wind ones, he was much more useful with his sword than the small beginner's wand he also
Makes
carried.
sense.
Then last but certainly not least, was the most talented out of all of them, Sarah. Sure, the other members were all B-ranked veterans, but Sarah's sheer talent placed her at a level above in the A-rank.
Oh, cool.
Her skill with the bow was just absolutely unparalleled. Combine that with acute battlefield awareness and an unprecedented
she
level
was
of agility,
very,
and what
like,
do you
yeah,
get as
look
a
at that.
prodigy
Yeah.
whose raw talent was comparable to Eris? Seriously, that was a direct quote from Rudeus himself.
Oh.
What makes Sarah even more exceptional, though, is that in a world where mages have greater range and do more damage, it takes a truly special talent to make those disadvantages seem irrelevant. Like, mages could just take a nap and recover their
I
mana.
never really thought about it. I just took it as yeah, she's the one flipping around and jumping and all acrobats all over the place. Everyone else is just running side to side, sliding a bit. She's alright.
While an archer was limited by the amount of arrows they were carrying.
Yo.
Their attacks could only ever hit one target at a time, and an immaculate level of precision was needed to ensure that they actually hit every time.
They don't stand arrows.
So, unless you were someone like Hawkeye or Legolas, you were typically better off learning magic instead of archery. That's not to say an archer was less effective than a mage, though, because if that archer was capable of firing 5 arrows before a mage could cast one single spell, or even land a critical hit with every one of their shots.
Because at the same time, most mages have to use incantations, don't they? They have to use words to cast the spell. So if she's that fast, where it's faster than spoken word, damn!
Then being an archer was completely fine. It was just extremely hard to become that skilled at it. Thus the reason archers weren't particularly common in this world.
Right.
All in all, as a group, Counter Arrow's raw combat strength was probably somewhere in the upper C ranks. When taking into account their coordination and cohesiveness as a unit, that's what brought them up into the B ranks. Individually, they weren't really anything special, but altogether their methodical approach to adventuring was amazing.
Go ahead, Timothy.
That was the conclusion Rudy had come to. So, given that there wasn't much room for an outsider to intervene, out of the 3 days they spent traveling to find the Grizzlies, the only support Rudy was ever needed for was the casting of Quagmire.
Sorry.
Whenever enemies...
I'm sorry. Timothy's name being said in an epic way sounds funny to me, and now we've got Quagmire, and I'm just thinking Family Guy. Oh, I'm going funny mode. Timothy!
were spotted in the distance, his only role was to turn the floor around them to mud. That way, any enemies that might gank from the flank would be slowed by a boggy
from the
terrain
flank.
traversal.
That sounds like some rap lyrics there. Yo, they got a gank from the flank. Gotta thank Timothy for backing me up.
Was difficult. It was a nod to Counter Arrow's systematic teamwork, but at the same time it also didn't allow Rudy to show what he was and wasn't capable of. Now, when the group realized they were surrounded by a pack of 60 bears wearing camouflage, everyone understood just how grim the situation was, but none except for Rudy accepted the probable death awaiting them. Sure, they were trembling in fear at the sight of 60 wild beasts wanting to rip them to shreds, but their determination to survive far outweighed those feelings of terror. No amount of dread was gonna make them give up, and it was that very resolve that started to resonate with Rudy. He wasn't frozen because of the imminent death that was coming for him, but was instead awestruck by the unshakable will of Counter Arrow. They were emotions that at first he didn't know how to process, but as soon as he saw the lack of despair on all their faces, he finally remembered that there were still plenty of things worth living for.
Wow.
He understood that it really did matter if he died. Yes, he may have lost something very important to him, but that didn't mean that he had lost everything. And it was that realization that there were still things worth living for that renewed Rudy's motivation to keep pushing forward, leading him to cast the spell Exodus Flame. So, in this moment where Rudy was just about to give up, it was an image of Roxy that had come and saved him. As the strongest and most determined person he knew, he could only imagine that she too would fight just like all the others
Wow,
would.
cool.
This wasn't a trait that she was just naturally born with, but was instead something she'd learned through her life as an adventurer. And it was that teaching of what it meant to be alive that helped Rudy realize that maybe things weren't so bad. But yeah, that's pretty much it for this cut content.
Cool.
If you enjoyed what you saw and want to see more, then be sure to like and subscribe for more Mushoku Tensei videos. I do plan to catch up to where we are in the anime. I just need a week or two to grind them out.
Okay.
But anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time,
Ciao. Cool. That was cool. Some interesting stuff left out, and it makes more sense of stuff as well. Know what I mean? That was cool. Yeah. We're on... Well, I've watched episode 2. I'm not sure episode 3 is out yet. Don't think it is. But if it is, then whatever. So yeah, make sure you check out my Etsy shop. Link is in the description for t-shirts and hoodies that I've designed. And thank you to my patrons. If you want to have your name at the end of every video I upload, links in the description to the Patreon page. $1 a month is all our self-sponsor channel. It's greatly appreciated. Thank you very much for that. And thank you all for watching. What do you guys think of that? What do you guys think of this? Click like, subscribe if you haven't already. Leave comments down below. Let me know what I should watch and discuss in future videos. I'll see you guys next time.